Some say life is a road whose forks are determined by an individual's decision from one moment to the next. If that's so, the choice that drove Ryan Gilchrist down a disastrous detour one day was a damn small one to have such an enormous impact. Maybe that's the way things always are. Who knows? The owner of the house where Gilchrist's crew was renovating the garage into a spare bedroom had spoken enthusiastically to a friend of his about the quality of the work being done. Not quite understanding what was happening at first, Ryan took the owner's cell phone from his outstretched hand. He found the man's friend on the line and wanting an estimate on remodeling his kitchen. The friend said it would be an anniversary present for his wife. Ryan's small construction outfit needed the work, so he set up a meeting for just past noon. The friend lived all the way across town, and the most direct route came within a mile or so of where the Gilchrists lived. Even so, Ryan would not have dropped by the house if the red Taurus hadn't cut him off. Ryan had to dodge quickly into the left turn lane, and once there, he couldn't get back out. He had to make the turn. After that, it was actually easier to go by home and take another major east/west thoroughfare from there than it was to fight through the heavy noontime traffic back up to the street he'd been on. He wasn't that upset. The laptop with its Excel spreadsheets and small CAD program would make things easier in the interview with the possible new client. He would use the former to work out an accurate estimate for the client, and the latter would show the man and his wife a reasonably good 3D representation of the finished kitchen. Oh, yeah, he could have easily done without them. He knew the pricing calculations by heart and could have given them a pretty good freehand drawing instead. When you get right down to it, the decision to get the laptop from the house was an awfully little thing to change a man's life. Coasting to a stop in front of the house, Ryan was surprised to see his wife's brown Toyota Corolla parked in the driveway. Carrie had found work as a teller in a branch office of a big downtown bank a couple of years ago. She was a hard worker and had already received a number of pay raises. The hours were okay. She only had to work half days on Saturday, and even that only 1 in 4 weekends. This Saturday wasn't on her schedule, though, and today wasn't her day off even if it had been. He didn't know why Carrie was home. It concerned him because it was so out of character for her. He walked quickly around the side of the house and in through the kitchen door. The door hinges were well lubricated. After all, he was a building contractor. It was a matter of professional pride to make sure small repairs around the house were taken care of immediately. Everything was well maintained. He liked things that way. He hated squeaks, drawers that didn't open, windows that didn't close right. Things like that drove him crazy. Neither the screen door nor the kitchen door itself made any perceptible noise when he opened them. The couple he could see through the doorway into the living room probably wouldn't have heard him anyway. They were too involved with each other. Ryan froze in his tracks when he saw them. He'd never contemplated seeing his wife in the arms of another man, even kissing him, and he'd surely never thought to see another man cupping Carrie's chest. Carrie was naked. Ryan saw her blouse and bra draped across the couch just beyond her. They were moving rhythmically back and forth. There was no doubt where was her hand. "God, Carrie," the man said hoarsely. "I've waited so long for today. Don't tease me, okay?" His voice turned more than a little plaintive right at the last. Carrie giggled delightedly. "Have you, Marshall?" she replied in a light, coquettish tone. She was playing with the man. "Was it worth the wait?" she asked seductively. A red-hot fury engulfed Ryan. He didn't think. He couldn't. He could only react. One moment he was frozen in shock. With his next heartbeat, he was moving swiftly forward, striding purposefully through the kitchen and partway into the living room. Planting his left foot solidly on the carpet, he brought his right one up in a tight arc that ended in the man's crotch. At the last moment, Marshall sensed something behind him. A whisper of Ryan's shoes on the carpet perhaps, or his looming presence. Without thinking, Marshall moved away from a threat he had not yet properly identified and into closer contact with Carrie. That was unfortunate for the woman. She probably wouldn't have been hurt if he'd kept still. The instep of Ryan's heavy workman's boot smashed into the other man and drove the man's whole body forward and up. Ryan was a strong man, and he'd had a few steps to build up momentum. It was only the steel-reinforced tip of the boot that slammed into Carrie's groin, but it was more than enough. Sensitive nerve endings fired instantly, sending simultaneous pain signals to two badly confused brains. For a long moment neither of them had any breath to scream. It had been driven from their bodies by the sudden intense pain in their abdomens. They stumbled against the sofa and clung to it for an instant. Ryan had time to set his right foot back down on the floor and ready himself to deliver more punishment. His normally pleasant features were twisted into a rictus of tormented rage. He took a step deeper into the living room and closer to the pair of interrupted lovers. He'd been planning to do further damage to the man in front of him, but it was abruptly clear nothing more was required. Marshall, whoever he was, Ryan didn't recognize him, began to scream in a high-pitched voice that filled the room. Carrie's even shriller cries started a split second later. Both of them collapsed to the floor and began to writhe in agony. The excruciating pain was overwhelming, worthy of the Marquis de Sada's most inventive tortures. Marshall and Carrie were locked in their own private little universes, unable to do anything but scream, so piercingly they were close to rupturing their vocal cords. Ryan stood back, watching the two thrash around on the floor while the screams assaulted his ears. The vulgar display sickened Ryan, but something else was wrong too. He looked down. To his horror, he saw the bulge in his work pants. A deep shame overcame the anger in his mind, blanking the fury in the space between two heartbeats. He was mortified. His own body was betraying him. He could not be aroused by the sight of his wife about to have it with another man. It wasn't possible. He was not that kind of man. His roars, born of renewed fury and deep humiliation, blended with the agonized shrieks of the other two. When he thought about the incident long afterward, Ryan saw he'd been doing everything he could to resist the urge to use the Glock Model 21 in its holster. From time to time, he still congratulated himself for not yanking it out. At the time, every nerve in his body had cried out for him to use it to kill both of the people who had dishonored him. He wondered sometimes if he would have reserved one bullet for himself to cleanse himself of his own body's treachery. The gun held 13 rounds in its magazine, and he carried the weapon with an additional round in the chamber. The urge for violence hadn't bothered him at the time and didn't worry him overly much today. Ryan had been raised by his grandfather after Ryan's parents had been killed in a fiery car wreck when he was 7. His mother's father was half Comanche, and the old man had been close to his grandfather. Ryan had quickly learned his great-grandfather, twice removed, had ridden on any number of raids when he'd been a young warrior in the late 1800s. He and his fellow fighters had made any number of forays into Central and East Texas from the Llano Estacado, the staked plains of West Texas. The warrior had died protecting that last stronghold of the Comanche from the soldiers who came to punish them for killing Anglos and Mexicans. His grandfather had taken young Ryan camping up on the plateau many times. He'd show the boy secret places only descendants of the old raiders knew of, places Anglos and peoples of the lesser Indian nations still would not go. The wildness of those windswept high plains was still with Ryan. He loved the solitude of the rough country. It called to something inside him, and there were many times he longed to return. Things would be so simple up there, just himself, the wilderness, and a need to survive. No, that he had wanted to put an end to the two adulterous lovers didn't bother him. In fact, he'd been unhappy for a short time that he had not taken care of the pair. The feeling had passed. This was the 21st century, after all. One couldn't do things like that anymore. There was a far worse problem he had to deal with. It made him a basket case after discovering Carrie's infidelity. It wasn't so much the mental pictures of the thing he'd come home to find his wife engaging in. Well, they were terrible images for a man to live with, but at least as upsetting was his own body's betrayal. It offended him on a very deep level to have been physically aroused at the sight of his wife preparing to engage with that other man. He hadn't understood it. It made him less than a man, and he couldn't stand himself. He had been so filled with revulsion he again considered the unthinkable. It had been a painful 6 weeks before he'd found a psychotherapist who'd been willing to take him on in a long series of individual counseling sessions. The wildness in his eyes had unsettled 2 other counselors, and they'd found they had no openings in their practice to see him. Dr. Christopher was in his 70s, though. There wasn't much that could intimidate him. He turned out to be a godsend. What it was, the doctor said, was a response his body made on a primordial level. Male animals, including human ones, have instincts hardwired into their brains that drive them to reproduce. It had to do with the propagation of the species, he told Ryan. Ryan was a civilized man, the doctor said, but no amount of civilization could overcome some of the most deeply ingrained primeval instincts. Ryan's subconscious, where mankind's most primitive instincts still lurked, had taken over when he came unprepared. Now that he knew what it was, it probably wouldn't happen again. The conscious mind could take precedence in such things. Most of what he learned was a lot more information than Ryan ever wanted to know about such things. He found peace with the first revelation that it was a primitive response to a situation he'd not been prepared for. Everything else had been added information he had no need for. He assured the doctor it would most assuredly never happen again, period. Dr. Christopher had made note of the grimness of Ryan's expression when he said that. It was disquieting, that is to say, threatening. It had been a rough 4 years. He and Carrie managed to stay together, but it had been a near thing. His preoccupation with his own body's reaction had consumed him for a long while. When he came out of his bemusement a couple of months later, he found Carrie doing everything she could to show him she wanted the marriage to work. She showered him with affection, respect, and admiration, offering it of all kinds and at all hours. She was, in short, doing anything and everything she could to keep him as her husband. She was deeply remorseful. Ryan didn't doubt that. He was angry at the deception and infidelity, but she was obviously repentant. After a while, he'd stopped thinking of leaving her and asking for a divorce. A separation ended after a few weeks when Carrie tracked him down at a local motel and tearfully pleaded with him to come home. They went to marital counseling for more than a year to get their marriage back on an even keel, and when they examined themselves carefully, cracks in their relationship were still showing up years afterward the counseling ended. Lovemaking never fully recovered. Though casual did improve after the counseling, the special thing they had to show their love did not. It was a year and a half before Carrie noticed Ryan did not like touching her right chest, the one he'd seen the other man fondling. She quickly figured out why, and then worked out the root cause for the fact that he didn't care very much for her taking it in her hands either. It had sparked another round of counseling, this time with each of them seeing their couple's counselor on an individual basis, in addition to the joint sessions. After a long time, the S got better, but things were never the same. Something at the core of their relationship had been shattered and never returned. Carrie had demanded they buy a new home after she determined Ryan's love for the old one had died. There were just too many triggers in the one they'd bought as a fixer-upper and made a good home of. In unguarded moments, Ryan would find himself gazing at the area of the carpet where Carrie and her buddy had writhed in pain that day. It was clear to both Ryan and Carrie he was never going to be able to come in the back door again without wondering what he'd see through the doorway into the living room. The 2-story house they found for a good price, and actually in a better neighborhood, had 4 bedrooms. In many ways, it was too big for the two of them, and they were always behind on the housekeeping. They kept it though, saying they would grow into it. For a while in their reconciliation, they actually talked about children, but Carrie didn't really want any. Not right now, she said. Over the months, the discussions about having children gradually withered and died away again. They talked about having a baby right after they were married too, but Carrie had plans for a career and kids didn't fit into her vision back then, and they still didn't. When she let the subject die this time, Ryan decided he'd never raise the idea of having children again. The decision left him empty, but he didn't know what he could do about it. Eventually, Ryan overcame most of his conscious and unconscious disgust with his wife's deceit and got beyond her adultery. He'd finally had to remind himself neither he nor Carrie had been V when they married. It wasn't easy, but he forced himself think of the man he'd caught Carrie with in the same terms as he considered the nameless ones Carrie had been with before he met her. Things got better, but Ryan couldn't get back to where he'd been with his wife. Something had gone out of the relationship, something he couldn't define, but he knew it was missing. They never really sat down and discussed her adultery in spite of everything their counselors could do to promote it. Neither Ryan nor Carrie wanted to go into the details. Perhaps they should have. Ryan didn't know. Ryan was going to be 33 in July, and some days he felt every bit of it and more. Today was one of those days. He'd found a small patch of gray over each temple in March, and it devastated him for a time. Carrie had just shrugged. They made him look distinguished, she said. Ryan had stared after her as she walked unconcernedly away. Distinguished? That was the way young women described older men. It was the kiss of death in the mating game. Bothered by the implications, he'd brought the subject up again a few weeks later. He didn't need to worry about it, she'd assured him. He was a married man and wasn't in the game anymore. He'd felt better, not much but a little. He didn't feel good about it at all anymore. Oh, he'd learned to live with the gray hairs, but he'd become concerned about other matters in the late spring. He wasn't at all certain he was going to be married very much longer. Though affectionate and attentive for most of the time since Ryan had caught her with another man, there was something different in her attitude and behavior these days. He didn't go off the deep end the first time she started an argument that didn't need to happen, the first time she criticized him unnecessarily, or the first time she seemed a little distant for no good reason. He didn't go crazy the first, or the second time he found out she wasn't where she said she'd be. After a number of such incidents, though, he knew in his heart what was happening. Soon, there was no doubt. All the signs were there now, the signs that said she was cheating. They'd been there for 3 months now, beginning just after Carrie's latest promotion. It wasn't entirely unexpected. He'd been concerned it would happen again, and he'd trained himself to watch for the first signal her conduct had begun to change. He'd read books over the last 4 years. Lots of books, most of them paid for in cash at a variety of used bookstores. Some of the books were by doctors of psychiatry or psychology, and others were written by licensed counselors with no other degree. Most of these delved into the psyche of a straying spouse and spoke of ways to recover from adultery. Some of them, though, were written by retired private investigators. It was this group of books that Ryan found most interesting and the most useful. These books told of ways to catch a cheater. They detailed indicators that should raise red flags in the mind of an alert spouse. Some of them had 100 or more signs a wife or husband might be unfaithful. One of these was written by an investigator and a psychologist team, and Ryan found that one very informative. Other books concerned themselves with techniques of spying. Some of them even used that term on a suspected cheating spouse. He had a nice library of books like this now. He kept them hidden in a storage cupboard out in the garage where Carrie never went. The spider webs in that corner of the garage and the heavy, greasy rags piled in front of the bin repelled her, and she shuddered any time she came within 10 feet of it. Lately, he'd taken the time to review many of the books just to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. Alarmed at the arguments about trivial matters and his wife's increasingly hostile indifference, Ryan hid a miniature, voice-operated tape recorder under the front car seat in his wife's 2-year-old Celica. When he retrieved it early one Sunday morning, while his wife still slept, he discovered his suspicions were well-founded. He listened to 2 conversations with girlfriends who had been in the car with her, and a half-dozen one-sided cell phone calls Carrie made. They all included references to someone named Sean. The last conversation on the recording, partially cut off by the end of the tape, confirmed Ryan's suspicion the man they were talking about was Shawn Michaels, Carrie's immediate supervisor in the main offices of the big downtown bank. It didn't surprise Ryan much. Carrie's first adultery had been with a coworker at the bank where she'd worked at the time. Marshall had been the supervising teller on Carrie's shift. They'd grown close over lunches and during long, boring interludes of little activity. It wasn't a big stretch to understand Carrie would be unfaithful to Ryan again with another supervisor. Once he made himself look, he found numerous signals she was cheating, and all of them were mentioned in the books. Carrie thought she was being smart and hiding what she was doing. She thought she had him fooled. Instead, Ryan knew what she was up to almost as soon as she started trying to deceive him. Such knowledge must inevitably lag behind the events a little, but he caught on very quickly, faster than he could have without having gone through Carrie's first adultery and its aftermath. Once he was sure of what was happening, he began detaching. He let each newly discovered deception wound him. He let the acid of betrayal eat at the love he had for his wife. It was a measured thing. He wanted it all to hurt. He wanted his feelings for Carrie to diminish as quickly as they could. It worked, and actually faster than he thought it would. Gradually, Carrie's adultery burned away his love for her. When he couldn't find a trace of love for her inside him, even in the lonely hours of the night, he knew he was ready. "Hey, handsome, want a booth or a table?" The friendly woman's voice brought Ryan back to his senses. He'd allowed his mind to wander a long way afield while he waited for the hostess to seat him. He was preoccupied a lot these days. He looked forward to getting his mind back. not having himself under control bother 5 at him. "Oh, whatever," he replied, not caring in the least if he sat in a cafe booth or at a table. "How about some place near a window where I can see out, but where it's quiet too?" "Sure," the short, rotund waitress shot back cheerfully. "Let's go over this way." Ryan followed her to a sunlight booth against the rear wall beyond the big group of regular customers and separated from them by a chest-high partition. "Can I get you some coffee, honey?" she asked while Ryan folded his 6 feet, 1-inch frame into the constricted space between the tabletop and unmoving bench seat. It was tight for a big man getting in, but once there, the table was at a convenient height and a good distance from his body for eating or working on his laptop. "Black, hot, and lots of it," Ryan returned. The hostess/waitress smiled. Not that they had any of the designer brews here, but she didn't even like being asked for a cappuccino or the like. It made her wonder just how much of a man a guy could be to want to drink something with a name like that. Her approval showed in her eyes. While she filled the insulated pitcher back at the counter, she let her eyes rest on the big man who'd begun coming in every morning and evening last Thursday. He owned a small construction company, she'd learned, one that specialized in minor renovations, interior remodeling, and some building restorations. He dressed well and usually in a tailored business suit, but his strong hands were calloused. This man had worked hard with his hands in the past, and most likely still did on occasion. Yesterday morning, Sunday, he came in with blue jeans and a work shirt on that had seen a lot of use. "What can I get you this morning, sugar?" she asked after pouring her customer his first cup. She put the pitcher on the table close enough for him to reach out with his long arms and far enough from his hands to not be in the way. He smiled his appreciation. "Orange juice, Western omelet, hash browns, biscuits, and a side of ham," he answered, pointing at menu item number 6. She'd expected that. His order hadn't changed the last 3 mornings. She took the refold menu from his hands after writing up his order. "Coming right up," she told him and walked away. She'd love to stay and chat with the man. The more she saw of him, the more she realized how much she liked his clear blue eyes, the strong chin, and well, he looked like he was a hunk under those clothes. She wondered, and then she made herself cut off that line of thought. She was seeing Fred had been for near a year now, and she didn't want to get sidetracked. He was too young for her anyway. Ryan watched her slide the check with his order under the spring clip on the shiny metal order wheel and spin it around so the cook could see it. The cook nodded his understanding he had a new order. The hostess rushed off to greet more customers. The line was getting longer. It looked like most of the little town had decided to not cook their own breakfast this early Monday morning. There was a rising buzz of affable conversation, punctuated with the sounds of pieces of crockery being bumped against each other and the occasional peal of laughter. The smells of cooking eggs, bacon and sausage, biscuits and cinnamon rolls emanating from the kitchen was making him salivate. Ryan smiled. He liked it here, and he was beginning to like the cheerful, pleasant waitress a lot. She seemed to typify the folks in this small town of village really. There probably weren't 500 souls in the whole place. Most of the people he'd seen here so far were a lot like the waitress reserved at first, outgoing and friendly once she got to know you. Yesterday, Sunday, she'd sat down across the table from him and chatted with him for 20 minutes in a slow period. It had impressed Ryan no end. There was a crowd of people trying to get seated now. It was early, but folks in rural parts of Texas still started their days early to avoid the heat of the day. It probably wasn't necessary anymore, and there would be even less justification once Ryan's crew upgraded the air conditioning in the old courthouse, but it was a thing their parents and grandparents had done. In the absence of any really good reason to change, they kept on as they always had. Only 50 miles or so outside of San Antonio, a metropolitan area with 1.5 million citizens, this small town hadn't changed that much from the way it was in the late 19th century. Oh, the big slab of concrete that was Interstate 10 ran east and west just a couple hundred yards from the front door of the cafe, but the regulars hardly noticed. He thought their grandfathers and grandmothers had probably taken as little note of the big herds of longhorns coming through after the Civil War. For the umpteenth time since he'd come here, Ryan wistfully wondered what his world would have been like if he'd been alive back then. He'd always had this feeling he'd been born about 150 years too late. He shook off the nostalgic mood. The hot coffee helped. He looked at it suspiciously. It looked and tasted strong enough to float one of the horseshoes another of his crews had dug up last Friday. They were clearing land out behind one of the local ranchers' house to put up a separate garage and had come across a number of interesting finds. A second sip confirmed his first impression. It might even have floated a couple of the heavy iron shoes. He was glad he'd come to the little town to personally supervise a number of small-scale renovation projects. This was some good coffee. Ryan Gilchrist was a small-time contractor, just as he'd been 4 years ago. He was still a little frog in a big pond, but that having been said, he'd grown quite a bit during that period. There were plenty of tadpoles swimming around in the pond that were a lot smaller than he was now. In fact, the operation had grown so large, he had to spend most of his time with his but firmly fixed in a chair behind a desk. He'd had to rent office space in a big building downtown. He hated working there. He often told folks he'd given up doing useful work. He'd finished up a degree at UTSA over the past 4 years, going to school at night mostly. He'd had to take time off from work and finish some courses in residence during the daytime toward the end. He came away with a Bachelor of Business Administration and Resource Management, but it wasn't as useful a thing as he'd thought it would be. When he'd been looking through the school's catalog, he'd thought the courses in this degree plan would teach him to better manage his burgeoning little company. Some actually had proven to be very useful and others were okay courses. Most of them, though, well, he'd had to figure out how to learn any number of irrelevancies just so he could answer test questions correctly. More than once, he'd had to grit his teeth and select answers he knew were totally wrong in the real world. That had irritated him no end. It was all over now, and the memory of the aggravation was fading quickly. He knew, though, he'd never go back to get a higher degree. His mind drifted from topic to topic and then back again. He was waiting for his breakfast to be served in a warm cafe full of friendly people. He appreciated the warmth and the friendliness. There was little of either at home these days. His thoughts automatically shied away from thoughts of home. He didn't really have one anymore. There were better things to think about. His business, things were going pretty well with it, everything considered. He'd even had to hire a secretary just to field all the phone calls that were coming in. Between her and a part-time CPA, the payrolls were processed and sent electronically to the employees' banks on payday. All of the federal and state reports were filled out and forwarded to the correct agency on time too. Ryan concentrated on scheduling, personnel issues, and getting all the logistical details taken care of. He had 8 crews working for him now, 52 men and women altogether. Half of them were ex-Marines and soldiers. He'd come to rely on their maturity and high sense of responsibility, and they'd responded. Most of the projects Ryan turned up were based on word-of-mouth advertising. His ex-servicemen and the others easily impressed the company's clients with their dedication, attention to detail, and the overall quality of the finished product. Today, he had 3 crews here in this small Texas town, out away from the big city. They were all working hard. He told himself, and anyone who would listen, that he was here in the little town supervising the joint effort. In fact, he was here hiding from his wife because he couldn't stand the sight of her anymore. No, no, he growled softly into his coffee cup. Fool me twice, shame on me. Huh, no damned way that's gonna happen. He wasn't about to accept a second adultery on Carrie's part. He wasn't certain why he'd stayed around the first time, but whatever the reason had been, he sure wasn't going to do it again. He had a plan, and it was almost time for the endgame. After he heard the first tape recording, he made a point of secreting the tape recorder with a fresh miniature cassette in his wife's Celica every morning and listening to the used ones sometime later in the day. He was amazed to hear his wife deriding him. His small contractor company, their friends, and virtually every aspect of their lives together. More than once he listened as she completely rewrite much of their history together. Some of the things she said he did, particularly anecdotes about how he treated her, damn it, they flatly had not happened. He'd never taken a hand to her, much less had he ever beaten her as she claimed. Most of the other remarks were similarly colored by revisionist history. He didn't understand why the woman he'd married was doing this. Gradually, Ryan had begun to put things together. As vigilant as he'd been, certain things had gotten in below the radar. He realized now many of their friends had been exposed to a steady litany of complaints she'd thrown their way. He could see the effect of her lies in their eyes. Some of the couples he and Carrie had regularly socialized with now avoided him whenever possible. When he did attend a function, he understood why they were reserved, even withdrawn, around him. It had to be because of things Carrie was saying about him. He knew why his brother-in-law and both sisters-in-law avoided him now. He understood why his wife's parents would hardly speak to him these days. Her disrespect changed what he intended to do. Before, he determined he would simply confront her with his knowledge and let her know he was leaving. Texas was a no-fault state. It would have been a simple matter of waiting 60 days for a judge's signature on a piece of paper. Now, he wanted proof of her adulterous conduct. He needed to go through a divorce trial. He would demand one so he could tell his part of the story. He'd have his attorney challenge every motion made by hers. Ryan's lawyer would propose hard to meet conditions in return. The hearings, proposals, and counterproposals would go on indefinitely. It might bankrupt him, but he didn't care. If his business went under, it would have the beneficial effect of keeping her from getting a share of the little construction outfit that was just beginning to grow into something nice. He had no way to refute most of her allegations. Most of the things she said were going on simply had never occurred, and it was damn difficult to prove something didn't happen. One of the persistent themes was that he was physically abusive. She'd repeated that in several cell phone conversations he'd overheard. That one he thought he could rebut. He had a persistent daydream of standing up in court and tearing off his shirt to show everyone the work-hardened muscles in his chest and arms. He was going to ask the judge whether he thought a 220-pound man with his obvious strength could possibly beat his wife. As Carrie told more than one of her friends, without putting her in the hospital for lengthy periods. It was only a fantasy. He knew it would never happen, but it kept him from freaking out in some of the darker nights. Carrie's deceit ate at Ryan's insides. It was a thing that demanded punishment of some sort. He couldn't understand where her revisionist history was coming from. He didn't know why she felt compelled to destroy his image with her family and everyone they knew. She shouldn't be allowed to do this, but he was helpless to do anything about it right now. The helplessness only made things worse. The anger was building inside him, and he didn't know how much longer he could go on. He knew himself fairly well. He just wasn't a man who could take something like this for very long without lashing out. He chuckled as he stared at nothing outside the cafe window. He'd remembered something the psychotherapist said to him. Dr. Christopher had told Ryan, while he was still a patient of the doctor's, that he was just a tad confrontation-prone. Ryan had laughed with his counselor. He knew the old doctor was absolutely right. In fact, he'd quit carrying the Glock a few weeks back because he was afraid he'd do something he'd regret. Before, he'd have used it to protect the love he had for Carrie. Now there was nothing left. She was no longer worth the possibility, the probability, more likely that he'd spend a long term in the Huntsville prison if he shot her or her lover, Sean. She just wasn't worth it. He didn't want to go to prison. His mind was still in neutral. There was nothing pressing he had to deal with, and he didn't bother trying to keep his thoughts confined to one channel. He wasn't trying to think his way through his problems. His thoughts wandered a little further afield while he waited for his breakfast. He didn't like jails. Even his slight acquaintance with them had soured him on them forever. The judge had given him an unbelievable light sentence for smashing his wife's first lover. The prosecutor, knowing his jury pool, had opted beforehand to reduce the charges to a misdemeanor, and the court had gone down that road with him. Seeing this, Ryan's attorney had talked Ryan into not asking for a jury trial. The sentence had been 40 hours of community service and 30 days in the county jail, a far cry from hard time in one of Texas's prison facilities. On top of that, all but 7 days of the jail time had been suspended as a deferred sentence. Even those 7 days had been pretty easy time. He'd only stayed in lockup at night and been released every morning to go to work. After 18 months with no additional violent incidents, the judge had vacated the rest of the sentence. He'd already done the 40 hours of community service, of course, and didn't regret it a bit. Those hours, and a couple hundred of hours extra, had been spent reading to children in the public library. He'd enjoyed that part of the sentence. Ryan had heard through the grapevine that his wife's buddy had been outraged at the light sentence Ryan received. Marshall lost one testicle and the other one healed very slowly. The man hadn't made any formal protest, though. His wife had told him sweetly they already had 3 children and that was enough. Besides, she said, If he didn't shut up and start making things up to her and the kids, she was going to cut the remaining bee out and feed it to him for supper. They moved to Denver when he was well enough. The first time he saw them on a restaurant menu, Marshall was physically ill when he realized exactly what Rocky Mountain oysters actually were. The family had to leave the restaurant, with grinning apologies from Marshall's wife to the hostess who just seated them. The kids were just as happy to eat fried chicken at the KFC down by the interstate anyway. Marshall never knew his wife passed the story on to friends back in San Antonio. The grapevine is a wonderful thing. The smile the memory brought to mind faded slowly. Another recollection took its place. On a business trip to Dallas a year ago, he'd found a store that was going out of business in a moderately run-down suburban strip mall. They sold all kinds of spy equipment, but the location had been poorly chosen. The owner was going to relocate to one of the major downtown malls, but there was a gap between the ending of his lease there and the availability of space downtown. He was in a position where he had to get rid of his inventory at cut-rate prices or store it at ruinous monthly rates in a warehouse somewhere. Ryan picked up a dozen lipstick case-sized cameras, phone line recorders, binoculars, a good digital camera, 3 VCRs, and plenty of other supporting gear for professional-style surveillances. He'd only used the equipment lately, within the last 3 months actually. It hadn't been necessary before. He'd hidden the small spy cameras upstairs and down, not knowing where Carrie would entertain her new lover if, and when, she brought him home with her. As it happened, she showed no scruples at all in taking Sean into her and Ryan's marital bed when Ryan went hunting one weekend with her father.